Picture this: Winnipeg buried under 4 feet of snow by January. Toronto with temperatures hitting -40 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks straight, and people who actually died because of the extreme cold. The winter Canadians still whisper about didn't begin as a storm. It crept in early, on November 20th, 1946, before most families had even finished rebuilding after the war. Primitive weather forecasts gave almost no warning, and what followed was 5 relentless months of Arctic cold, where daytime never warmed and hope froze alongside the plumbing. How did an entire nation get trapped in a siege of ice, with no way out until April? November 1946 arrived with a sense of cautious optimism across Canada. Cities and towns were still shaking off the scars of war, veterans returning home, factories slowly shifting from ammunition to appliances, families patching roofs and mending fences, hoping for something close to normal. Most expected winter to wait its turn. Instead, the first real cold swept down weeks ahead of schedule. On November 20th, 1946, Arctic air surged south from the Yukon, driven by a high-pressure system that parked itself over the prairies and refused to budge. The temperature dropped overnight, and by morning, the world felt brittle. People woke to a cold that seemed sharper and more insistent than memory allowed. In 1946, weather forecasting was a patchwork of telegrams, hand-drawn maps, and scattered observations. There were no satellites scanning the sky, and no radar to track approaching storms. Across the prairies, some rural districts relied on a single weather station for thousands of square kilometers. Forecasts, when they came, were short and vague, colder with snow. Many families heard nothing at all until the wind rattled their windows and the frost crept up the glass. Newspapers in Winnipeg and Regina printed brief warnings, but most people learned of the cold by stepping outside. The Department of Transport's meteorological memos from that week show staff scrambling to understand the scale of what was coming, piecing together reports from airports and the occasional pilot. For most, the first days of the cold front felt like an inconvenience. Coal deliveries ran late. Pipes in older homes began to freeze. Farmers already stretched thin by post-war shortages hurried to bring livestock closer to shelter. In towns, children bundled up for school in layers that would have seemed excessive just a week before. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became clear that this was not a passing cold snap. The sun offered little relief. Each morning the same biting air pressed against doors and windows, and each night the frost thickened. People talked about the weather in the language of siege. The cold was not just outside. It settled into floorboards, crept along walls, and found its way into every conversation. In the absence of reliable warnings or modern infrastructure, communities relied on habit and hope. Some kept diaries, noting each new low as if recording the progress of an invading army. Others clipped newspaper headlines, already sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. By December, the realization set in. This winter was not going anywhere. The routines of peacetime, work, school, rebuilding, were now shadowed by a season that had arrived early and showed no sign of leaving. Across the country, people braced themselves, not knowing that the true ordeal had only just begun. Winnipeg, Regina, and Toronto each became test cases for how much cold a city could endure. In Winnipeg, the mercury refused to climb. For weeks at a time, daytime highs hovered near -30 degrees Celsius. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth, just a faint glow behind a swoon thick with frost. On the coldest mornings, even the most seasoned residents hesitated before stepping outside. Frost formed inside homes, creeping across window panes and clinging to doorknobs. Breath hung in the air like smoke, lingering long after the speaker had gone. Regina faced an even harsher reality. The city recorded a low of -60 degrees Celsius during a blizzard in early February, a figure that still stands among the most extreme ever measured in Canada. But the suffering was not limited to nighttime. For days on end, the temperature at noon barely reached -40 degrees Celsius. The wind cut through layers of wool and cotton, biting into skin within seconds. Vehicles abandoned on city streets froze solid and their engines locked in place. Milk froze in bottles before it reached the doorstep. Even the simplest errands became acts of endurance. Toronto, sheltered by the Great Lakes and accustomed to milder winters, found itself trapped in a deep freeze of its own. Through December and January, the city saw daytime temperatures plunge to -35 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower. Streetcars struggled to run. Water mains burst beneath the pavement, sending geysers of ice into the air. The city's famous parks became silent white wastelands. For many, it was the first time they had experienced cold that seemed to defy reason, cold that made metal brittle and wood snap. These numbers were not just statistics. They shaped daily life in ways both large and small. Coal and wood stoves ran around the clock, but still the chill seeped in. School children waited for buses with scarves pulled over their faces, eyes watering from the sting. Storefronts displayed thermometers as warnings, not novelties. Newspapers printed the forecast in bold, but the numbers rarely changed. Across the country, people began to understand that this was not a winter to be endured for a week or two. This was a siege, measured not in storms, but in days and weeks of relentless, unyielding cold. The city records from this period tell the same story: average highs that would have counted as record lows in other years, and a population forced to adapt to a climate that seemed determined to test every limit. As January gave way to February, the cold did not loosen its grip. Instead, it pressed harder, setting the stage for a winter that would challenge not just comfort, but survival itself. Snow began to fall in December, and it refused to let up. In Winnipeg, the accumulations crept up relentlessly, first a few inches, then a foot, then 2. By winter's end, city records showed over 200 centimeters of snow, more than 6.5 feet, with drifts pushing even higher against houses and storefronts. Out on the prairies, the numbers grew even more staggering. Rural Saskatchewan reported snowbanks and wind-packed drifts rising 15 to 20 feet, swallowing fences, barns, even the tops of telegraph poles. In some places, the only way to find the road was to follow the power lines, strung high above what used to be open fields. Relentless is the only word that fits. Blizzards struck with a regular, merciless rhythm. One storm would howl through, dumping a fresh layer and driving snow sideways across the open land. Before anyone could dig out, another would arrive. The calendar blurred with storm warnings and whiteouts. The wind sculpted the snow into walls, hard, sheer faces that blocked doors and buried entire vehicles. In towns, men and boys rose before dawn to start shoveling, knowing the day's work might only clear a narrow path to the street before the next blast erased their progress. In the countryside, farmers dug tunnels from house to barn, sometimes crawling on hands and knees through packed snow just to reach livestock. Merciless sums those days. With every passing week, the snow grew heavier, denser, more impossible to move. Shovels snapped. Horses strained against sledges piled high with snow. Modern snow-clearing equipment was rare outside the cities. Most rural roads were left to the mercy of the wind and the strength of the people living nearby. In some districts, neighbors banded together, forming teams to dig out the main road by hand, only to see it disappear again overnight. The snow did not melt. It simply accumulated, layer on layer, until entire communities felt entombed. Impossible begins to describe the work. Official weather station logs from that winter read like a tally of defeat. In January alone, parts of southern Manitoba recorded 3 major blizzards, each one adding another foot of snow. By February, the drifts blocked windows on the second floor of farmhouses. Mail delivery stopped. School buses vanished beneath the snow, and children stayed home for weeks. In isolated towns, the only sign of life came from columns of smoke rising from chimneys and the faint sound of shovels scraping against ice. Defeat is how some wrote it down. The sheer scale of the snow forced a new kind of daily routine. Clearing a path to the street became an all-day affair. Supplies had to be rationed, because nobody knew when the next delivery might come. The world shrank to the space one could dig out by hand. For many, the memory of that winter is not just the cold, but the endless, suffocating presence of snow, walls that grew higher, days that grew shorter, and the sense that the outside world had simply disappeared. Entombed is the memory that lasted long after the thaw. Bodies began to appear in the snowdrifts, sometimes only discovered when the thaw finally came. The official death toll from the winter of 1947 remains an estimate, between 150 and 200 Canadians lost to cold and storms, but the true number may never be known. In Manitoba and Saskatchewan, coroner files and cemetery ledgers show a sharp rise in burials through January and February. Many of these deaths happened quietly, far from the eyes of neighbors or town officials. One family of 4, living in a modest farmhouse outside Outlook, Saskatchewan, burned their last lump of coal in January. When supplies ran out, they huddled together in a single room and tried to wait out the cold. Weeks passed before anyone could reach their property. By then the house was silent, its windows frosted over from the inside. The family was found together, blankets wrapped tight, lost to the cold that seeped in through every crack. Their story was repeated, in different forms, across the prairies. In rural Manitoba, a mail carrier set out on his usual route during a January blizzard, determined to keep isolated farms connected. He never arrived at his last stop. For months, his disappearance haunted the community. When the snow finally melted in April, searchers found his satchel near a fence line, half buried in the ice. His body was discovered a short distance away, evidence of a desperate struggle against wind and whiteout. The coroner's report listed exposure as the cause of death, a cold, clinical word for a fate shared by dozens that winter. Not all tragedies followed the same script. Some people died trying to reach their livestock, lost in the blinding snow between house and barn. Others succumbed inside their own homes, overcome by carbon monoxide from improvised heaters, or by heart attacks brought on by the endless labor of shoveling snow. Children vanished in whiteouts while walking home from school. In the hardest-hit areas, news of a neighbor's death might not reach the next farm for weeks. Yet, even as the toll mounted, communities found ways to endure. Churches and town halls opened their doors as makeshift shelters, offering warmth and hot food to anyone in need. Ham radio operators, working from kitchens and basements, relayed messages across snowbound miles when phone lines failed. In Winnipeg, one doctor made his rounds on cross-country skis, visiting patients for weeks when roads were impassable. In Saskatchewan, a Mennonite farmer turned his barn into a refuge, sheltering 15 families and keeping a wood stove burning day and night. Records from church logs and ham radio transcripts capture a pattern of quiet heroism, neighbors sharing food, splitting what little coal remained, checking on the elderly and the sick. The winter took lives, but it also revealed the strength of a network that stretched across farm fields and frozen streets. Survival for many depended not just on luck or preparation, but on the willingness of a community to look after its own, even when the world outside had disappeared beneath the snow. By late January, the machinery that kept Canada moving had ground to a halt. Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railways, the arteries linking farms, towns, and cities, found their main lines buried beneath mountains of snow. In southern Saskatchewan, a blizzard that began on January 30th became the worst in railway history. For 10 days, trains vanished under drift so deep that only the tops of telegraph poles showed above the white. Dispatchers sent frantic telegrams as switches froze solid and engines failed in the relentless cold. Some trains sat idle for days with passengers trapped, crews burning whatever coal they had left to keep the cars above freezing. Freight cars loaded with coal, food, and medicine stalled in the middle of nowhere. Cities like Regina and Winnipeg watched their coal reserves dwindle to emergency lows. Power plants faced shutdowns, and households rationed heat, layering on sweaters and blankets as the temperature inside dropped. In smaller prairie towns, the lights dimmed as brownouts rolled through, and families huddled in kitchens waiting for the next coal delivery that might never come. On the land, the losses mounted. Farmers, already battered by years of hardship, watched helplessly as herds of cattle, horses, and sheep disappeared under the snow. Official tallies from provincial agriculture departments only hint at the scale. Hundreds of thousands of animals dead, frozen in the fields, starved in snow-choked corrals, or suffocated when drifts blocked barn doors. For many ranchers, it was the final blow. Letters from the time described the spring as a season of funerals, not just for neighbors, but for entire livelihoods. The economic freefall was complete. The systems that once seemed unbreakable, railways and supply chains and the backbone of prairie agriculture, had been brought to their knees by the unending winter. By late April, the world outside finally began to change. The sun returned with a sudden, startling force, and 5 months of snow surrendered in a matter of days, the long thaw. In Winnipeg, the city's official snow total stood at over 200 centimeters, but the drifts were deeper still, packed tight against houses, and piled high along every road and rail line. As the temperature climbed, water started to move, first in trickles, then in torrents. The snowpack melted faster than the ground could absorb. Rivers swelled, swollen by runoff from fields that had been frozen since November. The Red River, already running high, began to surge. On April 27, 1947, the river crested in Winnipeg at 24.6 feet, a level not seen in a generation. Upstream in Morris, the water peaked at over 35 feet, flooding the entire town and pushing south toward the U.S. border. Ice jams broke loose, sending walls of water into low-lying neighborhoods. Dikes built to withstand spring rain began to buckle under the pressure. Evacuation orders swept through southern Manitoba. In Winnipeg, more than 5,000 people left their homes as water poured into basements and swept across streets. Towns like Morris and Emerson emptied out almost overnight, families packing what they could, livestock herded to higher ground if there was time. Schools and churches turned into emergency shelters. The military arrived with sandbags and boats, but the speed of the melt outpaced even the most desperate efforts. Across the Red River Valley, the flood waters erased the lines between winter's siege and spring's onslaught. For thousands, the end of the cold brought no relief, only a new disaster, as the thaw unleashed months of snow in a single, unstoppable rush. Extreme winters still threaten communities across Canada. Just ask emergency planners tracking record-breaking storms in recent years. The legacy of 1947 is written in every upgraded snowplow, every emergency fuel reserve, and every neighbor who checks on another during a deep freeze. Survival wasn't just about weather, it was about each other. In a world of changing climates, that lesson matters more than ever. Share your own family stories below.